A long time ago, when I was at Princeton Seminary, I used to see this guy walking around downtown or on the campus. He was always dressed in a dark suit and a white shirt and a real thin black tie, and often he'd be wailing his arms, or he'd be talking to himself, or he'd be doing something that was questionable behavior-wise. And after a while, everybody kind of got to know him, and everybody got used to him, and if he was really doing something that might put himself in danger, people would usher him away, and there was always talk about this guy. And people would say, well, he's a very famous professor here. And we'd all laugh, ha, 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 because everybody thinks their professors are out there anyway. Well, they made a movie about him. A Beautiful Mind. John Nash. This movie is from 2001, and it's the life story of John Nash. He was a brilliant mathematician who suffered from schizophrenia. And at a crucial point in the movie, his wife comes into the room, and they're young, they're newly married, they have a young baby, and it looks like John is going to have to be institutionalized for the rest of his life. And his wife comes in and looks at him and says, "This is real." She touches his face. "This is real." She puts her hands on her heart. She's demonstrating and showing him what's real and what's not, so he's not just deluded. And then she says, "I need to believe that something extraordinary is possible." So they decide to forego any medication. They decide to forego any institutionalization. They're just going to tough it out. And in the context of their marriage, he's going to figure out what's real and what's not. He won the Nobel Prize. And in that speech, his acceptance speech, he thanked Alicia for what was real, for believing that the extraordinary is possible. That's what Easter is about. On Easter, we discover that the extraordinary is possible. But that's not how Easter began. Easter began in the dark. It began in hopelessness. By all accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus had women among the company of disciples. This was extraordinary in and of itself. This was radical. But it was the women who on Sunday morning made their way to Jesus' tomb, not the men. It was just the women. And they were going to the tomb where Jesus' body was in order to anoint his dead body. This was Jewish custom. This was the right thing to do. And even though they were grieving, these are the kind of women that do what needs to be done, regardless of what's going on. They were going to anoint their body of their friend and Lord, but they were also doing something else. They were also on their way to the tomb to mourn their dead hope. It had been possible for them to imagine a better world when Jesus was alive. It was possible for them to imagine a world in which children had enough to eat and sick people got well. It was possible for them to imagine a world in which women were equal and everyone was welcome in God's house. It was possible for them to imagine a world in which there were no Romans in it, no one patrolling the streets in metal breastplates and pointy helmets, no one barking orders and no one demanding their taxes. With Jesus alive, they could imagine a better world. and that they could live in that world. But once Jesus was dead, they couldn't imagine that world any longer. This is what happens when someone you love dies. When someone you love, a partner, a close friend, God forbid a child, when someone you love dies, the world becomes a different place. Because you no longer can imagine the world with them in it. You can no longer imagine the future with them a part of it. Women make their way to Jesus' tomb to lay to rest what might have been. When they got there, something was wrong. The stone that covered the tomb had been rolled away from the entrance, and the women are alarmed. They think someone has stolen the body. We are told that two men in dazzling white clothes are there, and they ask the women, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" And now here it comes. From the mouths of angels to the ears of faithful women back then, to the ears of faithful disciples here and now, he is not here. He is risen. This is definitely not what they were expecting. One of the most common reactions to resurrection stories throughout the New Testament is that no one expects it. Even though Jesus predicted his death and resurrection across his ministry, no one greets the news that God raised Jesus from the dead with ready acceptance. No one expects resurrection, and frankly, no one believes it at first. So the women run back to tell the rest of Jesus' disciples, the men, and they greet this good news with utter skepticism. Luke tells us that those who received the testimony of the women regarded this news as an idle tale. And that's a generous translation. The Greek word is leros, as in delirious. So the men were calling the women delusional. It's never been smart for men to do that. I don't appreciate the sexist connotations of what these men said, but we must admit that believing this message is not easy. Resurrection is not an easy thing to grasp. Resurrection is not just the resuscitation of a dead body. Resurrection is the God of the universe, the Lord of everything, taking a step into human history and doing something that is unique and incredible, bringing about a new creation. It wasn't just the body that was raised, it was made new. God was the creator. God was recreating, doing something astonishingly new. Resurrection throws off the balance. It upsets the apple cart. It breaks the rules. It turns what we generally think is the way things are totally different. Which is why I think that if you don't find resurrection at least a little hard to believe, you probably aren't taking it as seriously as you should. God raised Jesus from the dead. God raised Jesus from the grave. And the extraordinary is possible. The extraordinary is possible, and our common sense is changed. We are rational people. We like to be in control. We like our lives to be predictable. The empty tomb rearranges our understanding of reality. It rearranges our frame of reference. Before we have an experience of Jesus' resurrection, we squeeze everything we know into our own understanding of the world and how the world works. But after we know something of Jesus' resurrection, it's the other way around. And our understanding of the world and the way that world works now fits into a new reality in which the extraordinary is possible. The extraordinary is possible, and our old certainties about life and death are changed. Death, Jesus' premature death, death in general, these are facts. No one gets out of this life alive. We are born, we live, we wear out, we die. Death is the final enemy. That's it. Lots of people live their lives with that exact framework. That's how they think it is. The empty tomb shatters it. The empty tomb shatters the inevitability of death, the permanence of death, the certainty of death. The empty tomb shows us that the power of death is defeated by the power of God. The extraordinary is possible, and our hope is renewed. Jesus' resurrection reveals to us that God is in fact doing something astonishing on the earth. God is establishing God's kingdom right among us. History now has possibility. Hatred, oppression, injustice, prejudice, and evil. These are all the things that led to Jesus' crucifixion. And all these things have been overturned because of Jesus' resurrection, so that now justice, peace, compassion, human dignity are not just idle dreams of a few nutty people. No, these things can be real. Right in our own time, right in our history, right in our own lives. Love is stronger than death. Love is not limited by death. It goes on. Let us live in hope, the hope that comes when we know that the extraordinary is possible. Here's why this is important. It's important to trust that the extraordinary is possible because God has something in mind for people like you and me. God has something in mind for you and me. Something that is wild, something that is crazy good, something that is unexpected, something that is astonishing. God has something in mind for you and me, something that will be outside our frame of reference, something that will last beyond our death, something that is full of hope. I'm not talking about something personal, and I'm not talking about something that's on your bucket list, and I'm not talking about just a goal that you have. I'm talking about making a contribution. I'm talking about doing something of eternal significance here and now with people you love. I'm talking about significance. God has something extraordinary in mind for you and me. And the question is, can we trust this God who raised Jesus from the dead? Even though it is hard to believe, even though it may take some time to come to a resurrection faith, can we nonetheless trust this one who raised Jesus with our security, with our lives, with our death, with our life beyond death, and with the meaning of our lives? I am not kidding you. God really has something in mind for you. And it may be something like this: loving someone who doesn't know that they are loved. Being a part of a cause that you won't see finished in your lifetime, but you can feel the momentum, and over time, it's going to change this world. Supporting an organization or an institution that's got a God-like mission that you can join and make last. Raising a child to know what's right and wrong and what's good and what's not. Providing an education for a grandchild. No kidding. You could really do something extraordinary. To you, it might not feel extraordinary at all. It might feel like a bother. But consider the long-term effects. God has something extraordinarily, incredibly, powerfully in mind for people like you and me if we trust. We need to believe that in the midst of the routine, the normal, the predictable, that something extraordinarily great can happen. And because Jesus is risen, we know that the power of God is at work in the world. The extraordinary is possible for you and me.